I don't know if anyone else in the country has seen something like it, but the area I live in has a bunch of not deer. It's not something anyone around here talks about a lot, but when someone calls you in the middle of the night in hysterics or shows up on your doorstep with a wild look in their eye, you know what they saw, and they're never quite the same after they've seen it. It's hard to explain what exactly the not deer is. The name isn't very good at telling you much. You know it when you see it. It will look like a deer, but only if you don't look closely. If you give it more than a glance, then you start to see that it's not a deer at all. I've collected a few accounts my friends have had about this thing. One of my drinking buddies, who we'll call Tyler, spilled his story over some beers at our favorite little dive. Him and I were sitting with a couple of other friends in the bar. We were all a bunch of 40-something guys who had grown up in rural Appalachia. Tyler looked around the bar to see if anyone close to us was going to hear what he had to say next. He told me that he saw it when he was young. In about his early 20s, Tyler was smart and had gotten into a university in a big city. He was driving back to his hometown out in the country for winter break, so he could spend Christmas with his folks. He was driving a little slow down a 2-lane country road on account of the ice and snow the area had been getting. He was keeping an eye out for animals, since he was driving through the middle of the woods, so he was well prepared for something like a deer to leap out of the woods and in front of his car. What not enough people understand is that hitting a deer out in the middle of nowhere can be a death sentence. They will wreck your car, and if it's a buck, you have the extra danger of the antlers going through the windshield and into a place they're not supposed to be. So it's understandable that Tyler slammed his brakes when he saw the deer. He came to a stop about 20 feet in front of it. Tyler sat there waiting for the deer to move out of his way. He told me that at first it looked like any other normal deer, but he slowly started to realize that something was off about it. Tyler told me that the deer didn't get out of the way immediately. He said it was wobbling on its legs like a newborn. It took a shaky step forward and then another, and then it began to walk more confidently until it was out of the way of the truck. As the deer was walking, Tyler realized that what was off with the deer was its legs. I asked him what about them was off, but he just shook his head. "I don't know, man," he said. "There were either too many bends in them or not enough. It was just wrong. Wasn't made right." Tyler said that as soon as he noticed this, he became more afraid. He said his heart felt like it sunk into his stomach. After the deer got out of the car's way, it stopped in its tracks. Then its head turned around to face Tyler. "It looked too smart," Tyler said. "It wasn't looking at me, it was looking into me." Tyler put the pedal to the metal, not caring about the ice and the snow on the road. He said he kept up that speed for 5 minutes. His heart was beating hard against his chest, and he had to take deep breaths to get himself to calm down. After Tyler finished his story, we were all silent. Then one of my other friends, who we'll call Jamie, spoke up. "I've never seen it," Jamie said in a voice that made me think he was lying, "but my dad has." Jamie said that it happened when he was a teen. His dad was going to the outhouse in the middle of the night. Jamie's dad brought a flashlight with him so he could see where he was going. He got from the house to the outhouse just fine, but when he was walking from the outhouse to the house, he shined the flashlight into the nearby tree line. Standing just at the edge of the tree line was a deer. The deer's eyes reflected the light of the flashlight back at Jamie's dad, making it appear as though the deer's eyes were glowing. It's something that happens with all deer and all lights, but it can still be unnerving. The deer ran off after a few seconds. Jamie's dad started walking back towards the house when he heard rustling in the trees. He shone the flashlight at the tree line again. According to Jamie's dad, there were deer standing about 5 feet apart from each other, up and down the tree line. They were standing still, just looking at him. Jamie's dad got spooked and booked it back to the house. The next morning, Jamie and his dad had to go into town for supplies. His dad told Jamie all about what happened during the drive, but Jamie said as he told the story, his dad seemed to get more unnerved, more scared. When he got to the part with all of the deer standing in line, he paused. You know, something about those deer wasn't right, besides the obvious. Jamie's dad was silent for a bit before he said, "It was the eyes. They didn't glow, and their faces, they were wrong. Didn't look like deer." "What do you mean?" Jamie had asked his dad. "It was like someone had to make a deer's face from memory, and then you stuck it on an actual deer's body." Jamie's dad was silent for a while after that. It was only when they pulled into the store in town that Jamie's dad spoke up again. "You know, Jamie, I'm starting to think what I saw wasn't a deer at all." Once again, our group of friends was silent. We drank our beer for a while. Then Kyle spoke up. "I've got a story." Kyle was a laid-back guy, never really partied, never complained about his job, and was never really one to strike up the conversation. He was usually the proverbial third wheel in the group. Kyle said that this happened maybe 3 years ago. He ran a hardware store in town and had fallen on rough times. He decided to travel to the city to go to a business seminar being given by one of those so-called gurus to try and get his store out of the red. He was driving on a country road towards the city when the deer ran out of the woods and in front of his car. Kyle slammed on the brakes and was able to stop before he hit the deer. The deer swiveled its head around to face Kyle. Kyle said, "It was like Tyler said. It wasn't looking at me, it was looking into me." Kyle just sat there looking at the thing, waiting for it to get a whiff of the smell of the truck or him and run off. But instead, it walked up to the car. It raised its front legs and planted its hooves on the hood of Kyle's truck. The deer just sat there, towering over Kyle. It looked down at him, staring directly into his eyes. Its breath was real heavy and raspy, Kyle said. Sounded phlegmy to me, like it was attempting to bring something up. It was terrible. My heart went into my throat. I just felt like something was going to happen if I just stayed there, so I did what I had to. Kyle said he pressed down on the accelerator. The deer lost its balance and went under the truck. The truck buckled and rocked as it rolled over the deer's body. Once it was up and over, Kyle slammed the accelerator and tried to drive away as quickly as he could. As he was driving away, Kyle looked in his rearview mirror. He could see the deer shaking, but it managed to stand back up on its hind legs. If you're ever driving through the eastern part of the country on an isolated road, keep an eye out for these things. They're a part of the forest here, and they won't mess with you if you don't mess with them. Drive safe. Footsteps echoed through the cave system, consisting of separate metal platforms. A walkway led deeper into the cave. I watched the back of my colleague as we descended, along with our helmet-mounted flashlights. A series of lights connected with exposed cable directly above illuminated our surroundings. Warm underclothes and boots protected us from the cold. This is amazing. I stared at our surroundings in awe. Chris, the man in front of me, shared my excitement. If what they say is true, it gets even better. We entered a large cavern among stalactites. Darkness obscured the high ceiling. The previous lights were replaced with portable spotlights. Dozens of tunnel entrances, including some on the ground, led to different locations. A wide array of equipment was spread around a circular table with a laptop. After a minute of soaking in the beauty, Chris opened his mouth. I expected a welcome party. They must be mapping out the system. I pointed at the only tunnel with lights. A team of 15 people? I'm sure they could have left someone behind to show us around. Now that I think about it, maybe something went wrong. It's unusual, but they would have called for help. I'm sure they have a reason. The team set lights in a signal tunnel, so I suppose that's where they are. Probably found something exciting. Yeah, but we have to wait here, it's protocol. Maha, yes? Do you feel that? Chris looked at the ceiling as if he were searching for something. I don't feel... My eyelids were heavy. Overwhelming fatigue caused me to lose my balance. I found myself in a familiar, circular chamber. The walls consisted of labeled shelves filled with boxes, parchment, folders, and trinkets. A sliding ladder led to higher areas. Bright sunlight came from the glass window on the ceiling. I pulled out a small metal box from between two chests labeled Favorite Movies and Childhood Summer Vacations. An ornamented text read, Grandpa's Lessons. I opened the box. The chamber vanished, and I was back in the cave system. I must have lost consciousness for a moment, but remained on my feet. My strength returned, and I successfully regained balance in time to see Chris disappear in one of the many unlit tunnels. His flashlight was off, yet he walked confidently in the darkness. Chris, what's wrong with you? I followed. The tunnel provided room for one person at a time. Chris, I pulled at his arm. Maha, what happened? I don't know, you tell me. I led him back to the cavern. Chris sat on a chair. I feel dizzy. Did I faint? You casually walked into a pitch black tunnel with your flashlight off. I don't remember. We should leave. I tried to help Chris up, but he was too weak. Give me a second, please. I looked at a display on one of the machines. Nothing dangerous is being detected in the air. Did you hear that voice? No. You just said you did. What did it say? No, I didn't hear a voice. Forget what I said. Just let me rest. I'll go back and get help. Something is seriously wrong. Are you leaving me? No, I'm getting help. I understand. You're trying to save your own skin. Save my own skin? My colleague is injured, and I need to get a doctor. You felt it too, didn't you? I did, and I don't know what it is. That's why I'm going to get help. Give me a minute, and I'll join you. Please, Maha. Okay, but we must remain calm. Chris seemed to be looking at something behind me. I quickly turned around, only to illuminate the first few meters of an empty dark tunnel. Did you see something? I didn't. I know something is wrong, but you're obviously not in a condition to think straight. Another minute, and we're leaving. Also, Turn your flashlight back on. I pressed the button on his helmet. Why'd you turn it off in the first place? Chris ignored my question. His demeanor scared me. Remaining calm was difficult. The feeling of paranoia, as if something watched us from the dark, persisted. Listen, Chris. There are people in the camp at the cave entrance. If I could... No! Chris grabbed my arm. Don't go! Don't worry. I'm not leaving. Just calm down. Deep breaths, deep breaths. Yes, deep breaths. Hey, Maha. Yes? Do you believe in heaven? Why are you asking? Chris appeared to have calmed down. It just passed through my mind. I don't know. I believe there's something after death. I will find out when my time comes. Until then, I don't see why it's important. If heaven exists, would you... Chris stopped himself from asking a question. Never mind. You look better. Can you walk? Chris got up. Yes, I believe so. After you, I smiled. He glanced at the dark tunnel he had been looking at previously. We both feel better now. Maybe we should check what's up with the others. There are 15 people. I'm sure they're fine. I was far from sure. You can go on without me. I'll search for them. He headed for the lit tunnel. Let's just take an extra 15 minutes to report what happened. The surface isn't far. Report what? How we got a strange feeling, so we returned? They'll send us right back in. Chris kept walking. Fine, but I'm not going in like this. I took a pickaxe from a tool crate and followed him. We entered the tunnel, which led deeper. Similar to the first, it had a metal walkway and lights on the ceiling. I have an awful feeling about this, Chris, and it worries me that you don't. I'm only coming because I want you to be alright. We'll check on the team and then we leave. Chris nodded without looking back at me. We reached a section where the walkway continued, but the lights ended. We relied solely on our flashlights. I looked back at the exit every 5 seconds to make sure the way out was still there. I hate this. I was so excited. Whatever happened up there completely ruined this experience. Are you listening to me? Yes I am. Just making sure. Everything is... Chris slipped. He rolled down into the darkness. Chris! I shouted. He had slipped on a puddle of black liquid. I walked around it and cautiously followed. The walkway ended at a black pool, knees and palms submerged. Chris struggled to get up. Help me! I didn't move. I'm here. Are you hurt? No, I'm fine. It's not deep, but it's sticky. Chris freed his hand. Something protruded from the middle of the pool. I couldn't make out the details, but it resembled a stone statue. Excitement replaced my desire to help Chris. Look there! Chris freed his second hand. Where? Oh, I see it. The walls had traces left from tools. A chunk of rock the size of a statue was missing. It's in amazing condition. Chris reached for the statue. Can you see what it is? It looks like tentacles wrapped around some kind of body. Tentacles? Chris froze. Maha? Yes? I can see it now. I can see all of it. You see other details? No. I can see... The sensation from before returned. Prepared, I closed my eyes. On reopening them, I was back in the chamber. Hours spent within were mere seconds outside my mind. Maha? Your name is Maha, isn't it? A muffled feminine voice asked. I looked up at the circular window. Behind the glass, a large eye surrounded by slithering tentacles watched me. The others lacked any defenses. How are you resisting? It's hard to hear you through this glass. Can you remove it? Who are you? Grandpa's lessons. What does that mean? Who is your grandpa? Is he the one who taught you this? I'm not letting you inside my head. If you knew what I was, why would you stay after my first attempt to breach your mind? Were you skeptical of whoever warned you? Unsure if we existed? Is this your first encounter? How much do you know? Enough questions. I'm not telling you anything. The eye scanned the chamber's interior. Aside, that little box of yours. I can't see anything interesting among all those labels. That is why I'm certain you'll be surprised by this. I blinked. The cave system returned. I spotted details I hadn't noticed. The black pool had imperfections. Imperfections shaped like human limbs and faces. Chris's body convulsed as part of his skin peeled off, revealing black muscle. His back split apart. An exposed spine shredded the caving gear. Sharpened bone pushed its way out of his arms, forming long blades. The pool didn't slow him down anymore. Smiling wide, Chris's head twisted to the side. A long slit, starting from his ear, all the way down to his stomach, opened, revealing crooked sharp teeth. His internal organs were replaced with tentacles, and appendages ending with eyeballs. Thousands of invisible needles attempted to penetrate my brain. Incoherent voices sung in unison. I bolted. The monster pursued. Its legs moved in an inhuman, uncoordinated fashion, yet it was catching up. I swung my pickaxe at the metal walkway. Bolts flew off and the platform below detached. It slid down, taking the monster with it. I didn't wait to see if it would get up. I returned to the cavern and didn't stop running. The songs and the pain in my head faded away. I could hear the monster's shrieks on my way out of the cave, but it didn't follow. I feel horrible for never warning my colleagues on the surface. I ran to my car and drove away. They wouldn't have believed me anyways. I will be forever grateful to my deceased grandfather, my inspiration to become an archaeologist. As a child, I spent summers at his house. He'd teach me history and tool usage. My grandfather believed archaeologists required an organized mind, so he taught me a method to visualize my memories. My experience in the cave proved that it was more than visualization. It was also protection. I'll be visiting his old house in hopes of finding more on the topic. 4 days have passed. It's night right now. I'm eating at a gas station while browsing the internet on my phone. I found a worrisome article on my favorite museum's website. In honor of a big discovery, the museum is offering free trips and entries to local schools. A photo showed the team who took part in the excavation. Smiling and laughing, all 15 team members, and my colleagues, including Chris, stood around a glass container with the statue inside. Chris had the same wide smile I remember from our last encounter. I can still remember it clearly all these years later. It was 1981 or 82. I'm not entirely sure, but it was November. That I do recall, late November. Winter had already crept in. You could feel the encroaching ice in the air, stabbing at your lungs when the sun fell. I, at the time, was sheriff of a small town that sat near the northern border, a town called Kendall. Started there around 1969 and became sheriff in 73. But that's beside the point. I'm retired now, been for a number of years, and often I get asked by friends or even my grandchildren to hear stories from those days, of which I have plenty. What is the craziest thing you ever did as a cop? My granddaughter asks that one a lot. You ever been scared? Ever had to use your gun? Usually I tell the same few stories about the time I was shot at, or the idiots that took me on chases up and down the highway. They're innocent enough for them, which makes me look like a hero and nobody ever gets hurt in the end. But the truth is, the thing that always stuck with me was nothing like that. Nothing so simple as some thug with a pistol or a junked up teenager stealing a car. Something that profoundly moved me in a way that no man should ever be moved. It began one morning, a gray cloudy day, when I arrived at the station to find a call had been left for us. It was from a young man named Jonathan, an Algonquin native whose father I had known well a few years back. He managed a small stable of horses that he would lend to officers if we needed to mount up. Jonathan said something happened to one of the horses, but he didn't explain exactly what, and said he needed someone there as soon as possible. He sounded distressed, and there was something ominous to his voice. I loaded up and set off his way. About an hour out from the highway, he lived on reservation land, and my mind immediately ran to the thought of a recent tragedy. A group of hikers had gone to camp up in the reservation, all of whom were still missing all these weeks later. I agreed to go up and meet with him, and took off in the police pickup in case the terrain got hairy. He lived in a small home pushed up at the edge of the forest line, and hidden from the highway by tall brush. My truck pushed its way up his dirt road and I arrived at the property. I had never been this far before. Whenever we came to pick up a mount, they would always be waiting for us on the road. It was in poor but stable condition, and there was a dark green pickup truck parked at the bottom of a long, steep hill, and I parked beside it. I could see the stables for the horses behind the home, but no sign of the horses themselves. It was a hand-built cabin with modern amenities, presumably installed by the man's father years ago. I remember the old man well. He was quiet and spiritual, a man of tradition, always showed respect to those around him, and never started any trouble. He died some years back, and I knew the boy took it hard. In fact, I believe the last time I saw him was at the man's funeral. He'd grown now, I thought as I climbed the slope. I was near heaving by the time I walked up to the rickety steps of the cabin. I rapped on the old cabin door. There was no answer. Suddenly, I began to intake a foul odor. It attacked my nose and caused me to recoil. I called out and received an answer from behind the house. I found him in a hole by the fields, and next to him, a desecrated corpse of one of his horses. Christ, I said. What the hell went on here? I found him like this, out by the forests. I don't know what happened. I didn't know the boy well, but I could sense an edge to his voice, as if he had been up for days. He took pieces of the horse and dragged them to the hole and began to fill it. I grabbed a shovel and helped, saying nothing all the while. It looked to be some kind of bear that got a hold of the poor animal, but he didn't seem to think so. There's something in these woods, Sheriff. Something out there, watching the property. He spoke as if he had been waiting a long time to tell this story. I began to notice it a few weeks ago. I saw it standing still amongst the cedars. It? I said. What is it? Some kind of bear? No, nothing like that. There's a spirit out there. I've seen it. I wasn't a believer of stories and myths that the Algonquin often spoke of, but the look and sound of the young man was deeply concerning. Is everything alright, son? You look pale and sick. You need to sit down for a while. He didn't listen, and so I asked him where and when he found the horse. After I began to feel its presence, I stopped letting the horses free in the fields. I didn't want them anywhere near those trees, but he escaped in the middle of the night, and I woke up to him screaming. He was sweating profusely. I heard his pained cries echo in the darkness, and I heard something behind it, some unholy rasp, unlike the sound of any bear or predator in these woods. His wide-eyed expression added discomfort to an already off-putting story. I refused to go out in that darkness with that thing, and I waited until sunrise to go check its body, and I found it there in pieces across the lawn. Bite marks all over it. He continued to tell me about the things he'd seen. He described the weather growing cold, much colder than it already was, and he told me of the sight of something that resembled a tall man sitting just out of view in the trees, how it had never moved into the light, and its inhuman cries that would call to him. They sounded like the ravings of a madman. Perhaps the isolation he had was getting to him. Perhaps he was using and in the middle of a bad binge. Anything I could think of to rationalize the situation. The mutilated horse was a different story, a very real concern. Writing it off as a bear mauling would be easy, but I never knew one that would kill and leave the prey to rot in mangled pieces like this. It simply didn't match their behavior. He stopped talking suddenly, jerking his head back and looking at the tree line as if he heard something. But there was no sound or sight to accompany the action. I asked him if he had gotten sleep lately, and he admitted it had been some time since he had rested for more than a couple of hours at a time. I grabbed the shaking man by his shoulders and led him to his door. "You should try and get some sleep tonight, son," I said. "Go into a hotel in town. It would do wonders." "I can't. I cannot leave my horses unattended with that thing out there." I offered instead a helping hand. I told him I would come back before the sunset and stay with him overnight so he could rest his eyes as I watched over his stable. He and his father had been longtime friends to us, and I figured it was the least I could do. Some sleep would serve him well. He thought for some time before accepting the offer, perhaps only because he saw little other choice. I shook his hand and directed him inside, told him to sit tight and relax for the day, and to call immediately if anything fell off again. So I set off back into my truck and headed on down to the station. I told my secretary about what I'd be doing and requisitioned a shotgun. I didn't believe any monster stories, but anything capable of doing that to a horse could do worse to a man, and I decided to not take any chances. Before night began to fall, I went home and told the family what I'd be doing. My wife immediately didn't take a liking to any of it. She begged me not to go, and the children looked at me terrified, as they'd been eavesdropping on the whole conversation. Convincing them took longer than I thought, and the sun was already mid-set by the time I could finally head out. I got to the reservation as the last of the gray faded, and began to exchange for a pitch of darkness. The truck lights cut through the dark as I navigated the drive path and pulled into the small lot at the bottom of the hill. I felt something was wrong immediately. Jonathan's truck was nowhere to be found. I wrote it off. I figured it may be parked elsewhere, and if not, then checking the property was the least I could do regardless. The outside of the home was lit dimly by an old oil lantern, and the inside had a faint glow of light emanating from the side windows. But this was not very reassuring. There was something gothic about the lighting, something off-putting. I never let my nerves get the better of me, so I took the shotgun from the back and slung it over my shoulder and checked the revolver at my side, just to get a feel. I grabbed my flashlight and began up a long hill. The walk felt like an eternity. The visibility was fading quickly, and I lost sight of the tree line before I was even halfway up. It wasn't until I was in the darkness that I realized how much the story had gotten to me. Every few steps, I stopped and listened out into the darkness, but I received no feedback. I navigated by oil light, like some wise man following the stars in the vast desert, and eventually I arrived at the porch. I noticed the door ajar, and I slung the shotgun around and held it in my arm, and cautiously stepped towards it. I called out for Jonathan, but I heard nothing. I pushed the door in further and began to step into the main room. It was covered in tribal decor and sparsely filled. An old animal hide blanket on some retro sofa, and a spectacularly woven dream catcher placed above it. Suddenly, the horrific stench returned. It filled my nostrils and caused me to almost gag. It was much stronger now and smelt clearly of death. I had to step back outside. I took a moment to recover and breathe. I pulled the shotgun up and stepped back in to comb the room. To my right was a small kitchen. The sink faucet was running lightly, and there was a cast iron pan with something charred inside. It was still warm. There were 2 rooms on either end of a small hallway, adjoining the living room. I worked my way down, checking each room with great caution. Both were empty. The stench lingered about, and unease set in. I thought for a moment, and I remembered the horses. I ran out the back door and towards the stables. I shined my flashlight into the darkness to find they were all empty. No trace of anything. The doors were either left open or broken off their hinges, and it seemed the animals were long gone now. My heart was pounding, and I was questioning whether to leave or even to call in backup. I was startled by the loud cry of an owl that was sitting atop the trestle of the stable. A grand white bird, at least 6 pounds. It stared at me with cold eyes before spreading its wings and taking off. The tree line was now eclipsing the rising moon, and a dim gray hue fell over the property, increasing my visibility by just a few feet. I slowly began to circle the house, checking the outside and occasionally flashing my light out into the field. My flashlight was strong, but no matter where it shone, the light could not penetrate into the forests. A black void laying just beyond the edge. I felt the temperature drop rapidly, a bone-chilling cold accompanied by a harsh wind. I buttoned my coat and continued on. I found a pair of cellar doors locked with a chain. One of them had a hole busted out from the inside, and what looked like a couple bullet holes going in around it. I tried shining my light into the hole. All I could see was a set of dirty stained concrete stairs leading into more darkness. My fixation on it was interrupted by an odd sound, an unnatural rustle. I turned and shined the light back into the blackness, but there was nothing to greet me. I probed the light slowly across the trees, letting my eyes adjust and take in what I saw before moving along. The flashlight didn't seem to be much help. Its effectiveness waned about 100 feet out, and all light was sucked away as it met the forest. I stopped on an odd-looking thing, a thin gray tree that stood out from the rest. It looked dead, sitting amongst a patch of shrubbery. I had not noticed it when I was there earlier, and I studied it closely, or as best I could. Immediately, something seemed off. It didn't look like anything that grew in this region, or any other region for that matter. It looked almost alien. 4 sharp, malnourished branches bent and hung low to the ground, and its base was rigid and sunken in. Unlike the other plants, it didn't seem affected by the wind. It stood eerily unmoved. I spent some time trying to match it to something familiar to me, but then it moved. It stood tall and turned, sprinting into the forest, moving with such an unearthly speed that it instantly became a blur, and half a second later it was gone. I had no time to register what I had just seen. I jumped in shock and instinctively fired my gun, but it was gone well before the clatter of the buckshot reached the shrubbery. It was so sudden that for a moment I questioned if what I saw was even real. I had in my head only the remnants of some horrid face that briefly disgraced my vision. There were no details that registered, only a feeling of dread that ran down my spine. I backed against the house, shotgun still leveled on my shoulder. Scanning the forest, I didn't know what to do. Despite the tree line being about 100 yards out, the speed in which it ran led me to believe it could close the distance before I could even react. I pressed myself against the cabin and began to slowly circle out, never taking my eyes off the forest. I would only walk a few feet before stopping and keeping a keen ear, repeating again and again as I made my way around the front of the cabin. After several painstaking minutes, I arrived. I stepped over the railings onto the porch, limiting the directions the thing could come at me from. The brief moment I needed to turn and climb, I entered into a panic. I scuffled over the rail and quickly turned to scan the trees again. Nothing. I took a few deep breaths and pressed my back up to the wall again. Suddenly, I heard a ghostly howl that came in tandem with the wind, almost masked and carried by it. I couldn't tell what direction it came from. It cried again, and then silence. The cold was now unbearable, and I needed to make a break for my truck, which thankfully remained unperturbed at the bottom of the hill. I knew I couldn't wait there forever. As shaken as I was, I needed to leave. I began my tactic again, walking to the base of the hill and listening. The ground was wet and slick. I had to go much slower than I'd like to, so I could avoid tumbling down. I was naked, completely surrounded by darkness, and going off of nothing but hope. Most of the trip down was without incident, and I was finally near the bottom. Before I could lower my guard, I heard the howl again. It seemed close. I swung my weapon and light at where I thought the sound originated from, and my heart sank when I saw a large pair of eyes staring directly at me. It was a large owl, sitting atop a tree and looking down at me intently. I took a sigh of relief, but was interrupted when I heard rapid trampling from behind me, followed by a loud bump against the metal of my truck. I turned again to find my vehicle swaying slightly. The creaking of the struts was the only sound now. I dropped to my knees, investigating under the vehicle. Nothing. I circled and checked the bed. Empty. I wasted no more time. I got into the car and turned the ignition. Part of me didn't believe it would turn on, but it did. I thanked God and began to reverse out. I took one last look at the house. The lights had gone out, but in the pale yellow glow of my truck's lights, I thought I could see it, watching me from the windows inside, but there was no way to be sure. My adrenaline wouldn't let me linger any longer, and I drove off as fast as I could, out onto the highway and towards home. The scene was something that would never leave my mind, but as unreal and haunting as that night was, the discoveries made the next day had stuck with me far longer. I kept what I saw to myself. Part of me didn't even believe it, so I knew there would be little luck in explaining to others. I simply said Jonathan and his horses were nowhere to be found. John's green truck was found on the side of the highway about 10 miles south. It careened off into a ditch and was totaled. There was dried blood on the dash, and a stained Bowie knife sat in the grass. Various articles of clothing were on the ground, and 2 sets of tracks led into the forest, one of them barefoot. This had been enough to acquire a search warrant of Jonathan's property, so I, along with my deputies, went to investigate the property that afternoon. The house was untouched, nothing misplaced or unusual since the previous night. I made an effort to separate myself from the others for a moment, searching the grass to grab and pocket the shell that I had fired. My priority was to check those cellar doors, and after cutting the chain and walking down, I had found the source of the awful stench. Scattered remains of bone with human teeth marks riddled all over them, blood-stained chains and cuffs nailed to the wall. My mind immediately jumped to the thought of those missing hikers, and my fear rang true, as the only DNA that could be extracted matched with that of Sally Miller, one of the women who disappeared. It was by far the most wretched thing I'd ever encountered in my work, and it's not one that anyone at the station likes to speak of. Jonathan was never found. What was left of him and his story ended with those tracks in those woods. I had only brought up the incident that night to my wife and a friend at the station. Martha was deeply concerned, and she had no issues believing me. She was always extra cautious around the forest scents, never letting the children near it. And my longtime friend Bernard told me it must have been some sickly, emaciated bear, and I never argued the point. I didn't know what I saw, but I know what I didn't see. I didn't see any creature of God sitting in those woods. The image of that mistaken tree has appeared in more than a few of my nightmares, and I never seem to get a clear picture whenever I think back on it. Not that I often try. I retired, never fully closing the book on the case, and in truth, part of me never really wanted to. Jonathan was long gone, and whatever answers there may be, I had no interest in knowing. Some things are best left unsaid, unanswered. The mythical evil that lay in those woods seemed too pale in comparison to the evils in the heart of what I believed was a good man. I don't know how long I have left, but I have to get this out to the public about whatever that thing in the Yukon is. My name is Herman Sterling. I am, or was, a biologist working for the Canadian government as part of the RAVN, a Spec Ops group of scientists that consisted of me, a biochemist, a geologist, a paleontologist, and an anthropologist. And I had been lied to by my government. I had to sign many NDAs in order to qualify to join. I went to the Amazon, Death Valley, and even Central Siberia on various expeditions. But this time was the most awful expedition ever. It was a boring afternoon of paperwork in the RAVN office in BFE, Ontario. When the file landed on my desk, it said that my skills were needed in the Yukon Territory in some project that would be explained when I arrived. Having nothing else to do, I accepted and headed to the White Horse in haste. When I arrived to the site, I met our team, composed of a biologist called Harold Hal Carver, a biochemist named Rebecca Willow, and a government attaché. Hal and Rebecca wore tactical armor and carried assault rifles, with 1911s at their sides. "Hello, Mr. Sterling," the attaché said. "You, along with Mr. Carver and Miss Willow, will be heading into the Yukon on a 4-day expedition to investigate a supposed wolf encounter turned deadly, hence the firearms." Before I could inquire further, a helicopter came out of nowhere and landed beside the attaché. "Remember, $10,000 for completion." The chopper flew off, and I was just left with my colleagues and the white landscape. "Well, Herman," Rebecca said, "we better get started." "Okay, but do any of you know where we're going? Or who that guy was?" I asked. "Nah, but who cares as long as cash is involved," Hal said. He awkwardly laughed while the rest of us just stared at him disapprovingly. He was a big-headed idiot. He could do work, but he was as smart as a bag of nails. Rebecca, on the other hand, was a smart woman. Could have been a model, but had a scar across her cheek from a car accident. Ejected from it, the poor girl was, with only a few broken bones, which surprised the first responders and doctors, who all said that she should be 6 feet under right now. After that awkward moment, I asked about the case details. "Archaeological expedition of all things," Rebecca said. "Whole team of 8 was ripped and torn to pieces." The team was later discovered by an Inuit seal hunter returning from the coast, who then ran away to tell authorities. "Why? Wolf?" I asked. There was howling in the distress call, and the hunter said that there were paw prints in the area, so the company assumed it was wolves. "Okay then, how far is this place?" "About 20 kilometers. We'll reach it quickly with the snowmobiles that we have." "I got a question," Hal said. "What is there to dig up here in the great north of all places?" "None of our business. We just need to investigate. Instigate, exterminate, and GTFO. With that, we each boarded our snowmobiles, which were faster than we thought. And along the way, I thought about how a pack of wolves could kill 8 people, since wolves are naturally shy of people. Rabies? My thought was cut short when I almost collided into the mobile trailer of the site. Rebecca and Hal were near the front of the trailer. "Nice place they got here," Hal yelled. "Yeah, nice place," I agreed. I went up to the front door and tried the handle. Of course it was locked from the inside, so I shot out a window and climbed through. The place was a mess. Notes were scattered everywhere, furniture overturned, and a corpse near the door. "Guys," I said, "we've got a body here." I unlocked the door for the rest of the team so they could see what's going on. Man, for someone ripped in half, he sure looks surprisingly intact, Hal remarked. No duh, Rebecca said. Hypothermia, the room's freezing. Must have tried to hide from whatever got the rest of them. Just then, a howling scream pierced the air. Did you hear that? I said. Hear what? Hal asked. I exited the trailer and drove the snowmobile around the entire site. I found nothing of concern, but I did find the main dig site, with another trailer connecting to 3 more east of it. I drove up to the main dig site in order to get a better look. I saw that the excavation tools were still embedded in the ice. Hey, Herman, Rebecca said through the radio. Is Hal with you by any chance? No. I'm alone near the dig site in another trailer, bigger than the last one. Why? Wait, so if you're alone, where's Hal? I guess he must have gone to patrol the perimeter. I guess. I'm coming to you now. Where could Hal have gone? I tried to contact him, but no response. Rebecca was coming to the site now. She came up to me with a concerned look. I gestured at the main trailer. Bet Hal went in there, I said. We stood ready at the door, with Rebecca aiming at the door and me kicking it open. The smell hit me first. Then a shape charged out at us. Rebecca hosed it down in an instant. Holy crap, Rebecca said in shock. What was that? I was too busy looking at the sign in the main trailer. Warning, biological specimen research area. Authorized personnel only. I thought that guy said that this was an archaeological outfit, I said bewilderedly. Well, me too, Rebecca said with shock. This is nothing like what I had seen before. She pointed to the creature, which was vaguely canine, and was 5 feet tall and 7 feet long. The inside of the trailer was a war zone. Bodies torn in half, organs, blood splattered across the walls, and Hal was nowhere to be seen. God damn, Hal suddenly yelled through the radio. Hal, can you hear me? Rebecca responded. The next thing we heard were gunshots. Hal, please respond, I said. This dog thing chased me away from the site. Killed one though. Okay, Hal. Head back to the trailer, where the snowmobiles are. We have a situation here that needs attending to. Roger. Be back soon. So there were more of those things out there? But how many? I turned to the interior of the trailer. There were computers on desks, connecting to 6 kennels. So there are 6 of them, I thought to myself. I headed to a cross intersection that connected the trailer that we were in to 3 separate others, and found a dead researcher in front of a hatch to what appears to be a common area. I opened the door and investigated the area. There was nothing of interest in there. As I was about to leave, I heard growling behind me. I turned around and saw that the wolf-like thing was staring me down. The flesh of its head was torn in every place imaginable. Its lower jawbone was showing, glossy eyes looking at me with pure hunger. I shot at it, but it crossed the room in the blink of an eye and clawed me in the arm. I then shot at it, with all my bullets burying themselves into its head. Damn, I said, looking at my arm. After leaving the personal quarters, I felt the wound getting hot. I didn't care at first, but then I found the labs. The place was surprisingly clean, with everything in order, with notes that I read. What I saw made my blood run cold. bacterial type virus. Incubation time, 1 to 2 hours. Transmission, blood, liquid, and other fluids. We discovered this pathogen in an ancient wolf carcass. Dire wolf to be exact. The virus apparently causes symptoms similar to rabies, is transmittable to humans, and tests with gray wolves have confirmed this. It appears that it is capable of surviving modern-day sanitizers, and they're... Herman, I think those dog things are back, Rebecca said, interrupting my thoughts. I think I killed some of them. 3, I think. I heard the gunshots in the base. Are you okay? I couldn't respond. How could I? I was just infected by an unknown disease, and I need to get Rebecca and Hal out of here now. Rebecca, I need you and Hal out of here. What? Are you insane? Please, tell the government to burn this place to the ground. What on God's green earth is going on? Hal blurted through the radio. It's a disease, I screamed at both of them. Get out, and stay gone. Send the military, send everybody. Get out of here. Silence. Herman, Rebecca said with fear in her voice. Please. I feel so hot. Leave. Then, I heard a snowmobile engine start up, and I felt relieved. At least this disease couldn't claim any more victims. I am writing this as I burn up inside, hoping someone can call the police, tell them to rope off this area, and save the world. But I don't care anymore. I just feel hot, and so hungry. When you lose a child, the therapists say all kinds of things about the grieving process. You'll search for any reason to blame yourself. You'll play the last moments in your head on repeat. You'll go numb for months on end. But there's one thing my grief counselor never told me. She never said anything about the noise. None of the books talked about it either. The giggles and coughs and creaking of doors, the bouncing of cupboards and the clinking of toys, all the sounds a child fills a house with, vanish in a breath. The silence that remains bears down on you like smoke. It suffocates you. Sometimes it kills you. And then, one day, as you drift like a wraith down the empty hallways of your home, a sound rings out in the quiet. Sometimes it's a sniffle. Sometimes it's little footsteps. Your brain dismisses the noise because it's so familiar, so commonplace. Then reality catches up and reminds you that your child is gone. I was in bed the first time it happened. A faint yawn stirred me from my sleep. I ignored it and rolled over, knowing it was just Sophie in her room nearby. A few seconds later, I jolted upright, trying to remember if the hell I'd been living was all a dream, trying to remember if my daughter was really just down the hall. It doesn't matter how much time passes, I always hear the noises, and the realization is always the same. Sophie's gone. She's never coming back. Some part of my brain just can't let her go, and fills the vacuum of her absence with fleeting signs of life. I've been trapped in this house with a head full of ghosts for half a year now. At first, I heard the noises only as I went about my day, but soon, they began to spill into my dreams. I'd sometimes be awoken by her laughter, or by my own cries as I tore through the woods in search of her. With the passage of time, I began dreaming of something worse. It's not the one where I find out that she ran away on purpose, or the one where the cops tell me they found a body. It's darker, more sinister. Something comes out of the woods towards my house. It comes at night, and it looks up at the windows. I always know what it wants. In some dreams, it stands outside my daughter's room and calls to her in a raspy voice. I watch her open the window and vanish into the freezing dark. I never actually see the thing. I always scream myself awake the moment it turns to look at me. I'm afraid to sleep. I spend almost no time in my bedroom. Instead, I try to nap in the living room with music playing, or I try to get work done in the downstairs office. Then, a week ago, I heard it while I was awake. A strange noise somewhere outside. It crackled like a branch snapping or a fence breaking. I grabbed a flashlight and my dad's old crowbar and stepped out into the cold. My property spanned a few acres, and the far end of the yard backs up against thick woods. A while back, an old couple driving home from church claimed they'd seen a girl matching Sophie's description. They saw her walking towards the forest, but nothing ever turned up. I circled my house, but I couldn't locate the source of the noise. It happened again for 3 consecutive nights. On the last, I was ready for it, and threw the back door open the moment that the crackling arose. There, at the edge of the woods, something lurched between the trees and receded into the darkness. Sleep barely came at all after that. My mind kept tying the wicked dreams to what was happening outside, and soon, I came to believe that whoever or whatever was visiting my house wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Last night, my visitor returned. I watched it from the window in the upstairs hall. I saw it emerge from the murky woods and move across the field beneath a pale moon. The thing didn't walk with the familiar rhythm of a biped. Instead, it skittered, transferring its weight fluidly from one indiscerning limb to another, or occasionally rolling and diving like a tumbleweed. All the while, its pallid head bobbed around on a contorted neck, studying everything or nothing at all. As the ground and sky rushed past, the creature made its way around my house, touching and tapping and scratching on doors and windows, looking for a way in. I scrambled for the knife, and just as I did, there was a knock on the front door. It was a polite but purposeful knock, and had I not seen the hideous thing outside moments before, I'd have been certain it was a neighbor checking in on me. I stood there at the top of the stairs in the darkness of my home, gazing down at the front door as the knocks repeated in threes. My body went stiff, and the longer I froze there, the more intense the knocking grew. Soon, the thing outside pounded and scratched at my door, with such force that the dreadful sounds echoed throughout every inch of the house. The creature issued desperate groans and rattled the knob, swelling with rage each passing moment. At last, I regained control of myself and snuck down the stairs, crowbar in hand, ready to shred this thing to bits if it came inside. The old door reached the end of its integrity and split apart, revealing a sight so gruesome I nearly vomited. My eyes perceived the being's parts, but my brain couldn't compose them into a familiar object. Snarls of rotten wood and bone, hanging scraps of flesh, ropes of vine and slick, red muscle that twitched and rippled as the monster breached my entryway. The hulking mass rushed towards me, wet feet slapping the hardwood floor, leaving trails of soil and blood. I tried to scream as the thing seized me up in its grip and studied me. I tried to slice at it, but it clamped down on my arm with breathtaking strength. It yanked me close to its dry and sallow face, and I imagined the head might have been stolen from a near-fresh corpse. The thing peered down into my soul with lidless eyes that screamed in terror, as if witness to something even more ghastly than itself. It mumbled something to me, something wet and guttural, and my gaze fell on the crown jewel of its horrors, a set of ragged, gory lips stretched over 100 mismatched teeth. What looked like fishing line snaked its way through the maw, sewn with cruel hands, pulled taut to imprison the face in an eternal grimace. The room went sideways and my back slammed against the floor. The ceiling flew past and gave way to the starry sky. Wet grass licked my skin. My screams filled the night air and reverberated all around me. I hacked and slashed at its putrid hand, but the creature never stopped dragging me towards the woods. I knew death awaited, and soon the shadows swallowed me up. Pitiful groans echoed in the forest all around me, but they were not mine. They came from a man in terrible pain, and the image of a half-eaten person crawling around in the leaves appeared in my mind's eye. I was probably next. The moans grew louder and louder, until finally my captor snatched me off the ground and stood me upright, gripping my head in its gnarled hands to show me something. A naked man, near dead, bound to a tree with a net of roots and vines. "Mark?" I said in disbelief. I knew this man. He lived a few miles up the road, and we always ran into each other down at the general store. He even knew my kid. "Oh God," he sobbed. He wasn't relieved to see me. In fact, he hid his eyes as much as he could. Mark had taken a brutal beating. Purple and black welts covered his face, and lacerations of varying depths crisscrossed his body. Dry blood caked his form like war paint. Who knows how long he'd been captive? The creature pressed its rotten face against my ear and mumbled something indecipherable. It let me go and lurched towards the wounded man. Growling through its jagged teeth, Mark wailed for mercy, but the creature would give him none. It grabbed his throat and squeezed until Mark's eyes bulged wide open, and then it pointed a long, crooked finger in my direction. "Yes," Mark cried between shallow breaths. "Yes, okay, it was me. It was me, Felix." The creature watched me, awaiting my reaction, but Mark's words locked me down as tightly as the roots that held him. Memories of my daughter flooded my thoughts like a drug, fast and warm, taking my mind far away from the gloomy woods we stood in. "I told her to follow me," he continued. I tricked her. I'm sick, Felix. My head has been messed up for so long. 'Cause of my old man. I can feel him in me, making me ugly." The images of little Sophie, laughing and playing and holding my hand, sped up. They drifted by faster and faster, until they all blurred into each other. From the day she was born, through saying goodbye to her mom in the hospital, to the last time I saw her get on the school bus at the end of the road. My mind raced over the memories of me arriving just a few minutes late that evening. The bus was already gone, and so was my daughter. A long moment passed. The creature never tore its dead gaze from me. Then, the only words I could find came slinking out of my mouth in a meek whisper. "She trusted you." Hearing those words out loud ignited hellfire inside me. My reason evaporated, and inevitable hatred settled over me. like the fog that snaked between the trees. I charged at Mark, crowbar in death grip. I wanted to bury it in the mouth he spoke to my child with. But before I could reach him, the creature intercepted me and stopped me dead in my tracks. It pried the crowbar from my hands and flung it into the woods. It peered into my eyes. I stared into a face transformed by death, and yet I could see it come alive with sorrow. It looked as revolted as I felt. What this thing knew of human ethics was inscrutable, but it seemed to understand the situation in a natural context. The man was a predator, and my little girl was the prey, and it seemed to detect that this sort of hunting was not the normal order of things. The man wasn't hunting to eat, but rather to satiate a darker sort of hunger. The creature released me and pointed to a nearby tree. At its base lay a white bedsheet, likely taken from the clothesline of a nearby farmhouse. My eyes moved over the contours of its surface, tracing the gentle features of a child's body. My heart collapsed into a dark hole. My chest nearly caved in with it. All this time, I had said it is worse to have a missing child than a dead one, because in death, at least you have an answer. But the moment Sophie's shape registered in my head, I'd have given anything for her to go back to being a question mark. The creature pointed back the way he had come, back to my home. Then it reached up to its horrid face. It tore at the wire that had sealed its mouth and snarled when the ragged lips came free. It returned to Mark and grabbed his throat, as it had before, but this time it thrust its face against his. Horrified shrieks rang out in the woods, followed by the sickening sound of flesh splitting away. It looked back at me, gagging on the tongue it had just stolen from the man, until finally the appendage slipped into place. The creature then said, "Leave." I ignored the lightning bolts of pain that arced between my head and my chest and scooped up Sophie's remains, bedsheet swaddling her tiny form. Mark's howls followed me to the edge of the woods, then cut out abruptly as I stepped into the fields. The walk home was a solemn one, guided by the fire of a cresting sun. I broke ground just beneath my bedroom window and dug until the dawn light reached the western hills. By the time I patted the last heap of dirt onto Sophie's resting place, the shadows had vanished from the edge of the woods, except for one. It loomed for just a while, then receded, never to darken my fields again. In time, the sounds that had once haunted me receded too, and I could finally grieve in peace. High school, a time where teens become adults and learn the rest of what basic education has to offer. A time where connections are made, and some of those linger for years, even long past the days of their youth. A place where chaos meets order, resulting in a beautiful thing we call controlled chaos. I'll admit, I was nervous to start physical high school as a sophomore, after quarantine had caused my freshman year of high school to be at home. I'm not going to lie, I did very poorly my freshman year, and only moved on to my sophomore year because there were so many students flunking their classes for the same reasons as me that the school corporation couldn't possibly afford to hold students back, so everyone just went on to their next year. I would still say I'm lucky, however, as I have some friends in this with me, 3, not counting the ones who moved off but still contacted me. Their names are Brandon, Seymour, and Catherine, or Kat, as we call her. We've all been together since our first year in middle school, except for Brandon. He and I go way back to first grade, and despite some rough patches in our friendship, we are still incredibly close. Brandon and I also share the same bus route, so we often talked on the bus about our lives, family, pets, you name it. Seymour and Catherine are unfortunately on a different bus route than Brandon and me, so we don't get to have early morning conversations, but I do happen to share a few classes with Seymour and Catherine. Seymour and Kat are both in my gym class every other day, and Seymour is in my English class on the same day as my gym class. We also meet in the same place in the auxiliary gym, talk for a bit, before Brandon bolts off to get to his class across the school before the bell. Pulling up to the school in one of those rickety old buses that first day was, well, unnerving. My high school, for whatever reason, is actually surrounded by woods, with 2 roads heading in and out of the campus, one for cars and one for buses. Looking through the canopy of trees above as the bus rattled down the road put a sense of dread in me that I can't quite describe. Looking back at Brandon, I could tell he felt a bit odd about this too, even though he's already been inside of the school more than once. The road was desolate as always, which honestly makes sense, seeing as there's only a small gas station, the high school, and an abandoned building down that way. Most townfolk never would come here unless they had business in that area, so in a sense, this area was cut off from the world. Brandon cracked a few jokes about how we seemed to have just wandered right into Silent Hill, almost, to which I laughed, and occasionally made a snarky remark back to him. As we pulled up to the school, I could already tell that the first day would either go horribly bad or impossibly well. No in between. The building looked aged and weathered, but kept up to date just barely, so that it wouldn't be condemned. The parking lot on one side was barren. No cars or people in sight, just the cracking concrete with the streetlights above them, occasionally flickering. The other side was full of cars, but still in the same rundown state. As we pulled slowly towards the area where the buses unloaded, Brandon made a comment to me that stuck out. "Did you know the school has a basement?" I didn't really know how to respond in all honesty. I wasn't surprised at the statement, as a school this large could have a basement without anything weird going on. Yet Brandon still said it in a manner that made it seem odd, mysterious, and even foreboding in some ways. I eventually told him that I wasn't really surprised, as I began to gather my belongings to get off of the bus. "It's been here forever, but no students are allowed in," he stated, before popping a joke about there being a secret torture chamber below the tile floors of the halls. I told him that it was probably just a storage room or perhaps rooms that were intended for classes, but were deemed unfit of day-to-day use, so they may have just closed it completely. As the bus slowed to a halt, Brandon smiled at me. "We should go there at some point, you know." I chuckled a bit at this statement as the bus doors opened with a hiss. As the whole vehicle began to sway as the kids got off in a single file line, Brandon eventually jumped up in between this girl who honestly looked too old to be attending high school, and a really tall kid who I later learned was named Brian. He blocked the other students from leaving for the moment until I got into the line, and we got off together onto the pale sidewalk leading up to the side entrance of the building. As we walked through the muggy summer morning heat, Brandon asked me where I was headed. "Gym, I believe," I replied, hoping I had remembered my schedule right. "Ah, I can take you there," Brandon said, speeding up just a bit to almost guide me into the building. As I set foot onto one of the concrete stairs leading into the side entrance, I got this strong nostalgic feeling deep within me. As my mind made an effort to recall the very first time I set foot into my elementary school, I paused for the briefest of moments before I stepped forward more and up those last few faded steps and into a threshold and through the door, following Brandon. Entering the building, I was hit with a still air that made me cough a little. It was as though this was the first breath of life this building had felt in a century, and it honestly looked like that as well. Lockers with paint scraped up, rusty metal lining the walls, which looked as though they had been painted in the early 1800s by their condition. The tile on the floor was scratched, aging like the exterior, and fluorescent lights hung above us on a stained ceiling. I continued to follow Brandon through the maze of hallways, having to grab onto his bag as to not lose track of him in the surprisingly heavy flow of students. After a very brief while of this, he led me into a more open room. I quickly realized this must have been the main hall. Stairs of stone sat in the middle, leading up to the second floor of the building, congested beyond belief with students. I kept an even pace as I walked behind him, but now a little further back, taking in the view. After some time, he led me down a hallway that was actually remarkably well kept. The lights were shining bright, and the floor looked unscathed. The walls weren't painted, but the brick looked freshly washed. He turned left, and I followed into a large, fancy gym. The court was on a lower level, and the bleachers that we were walking past were raised up to view the games that would take place here. The gym floor looked newly waxed, and I kept following Brandon as I looked around at the almost spotless gym. He then took me down another, shorter hall to the left of the gym and into another smaller gym. This one was notably less kept, and it looked like the rest of the school. Boards covered areas of the opaque glass way above, and the floor creaked below from any weight. Brandon stopped for a moment, motioning his hands. This is the auxiliary gym, aka where the PE classes are. He paused just as Seymour and Kat called over to us. I turned, beaming as they ran towards me and Brandon, and Seymour waved. "Hey y'all, long time no see," Kat said, stopping barely 2 inches from me. Seymour caught up not long after, and politely waved once more. "You in this class?" he asked to both me and Brandon. Brandon shook his head, and said that he had to get to his next class. I, on the other hand, nodded, and Seymour smiled happily. Brandon departed from us as Seymour and Kat led me over to a door on the far end of the gym, bolted up tight, with a rack of balls in front of it. As though it was a warning to stay away, Kat enthusiastically asked me and Seymour a question. "Did you all hear about the biggest rumor in this dump?" Seymour, as though he were acting, said, "Depends on what it is," in a tone so bored it were as though he would rather be in the pounding heat outside, doing nothing, rather than have this conversation. I answered after him, "I'm not too sure what you're talking about, honestly." A grin grew across Kat's face as she pushed the ball rack to the side, as Seymour visibly cringed. "Kat, if it's the basement, the teacher will have your hide," he stated, backing up a little, clearly knowing where this was going. Kat only giggled in response. What else would it be, Seymour? Every year students have tried to get into the basement, but not many succeed, as the door is bolted up tight. However, there could be another way in. She was cut off by Seymour's sigh. "Kat, we haven't even been here a day, and you're already obsessed with the basement? "How do you know it's not another supply closet?" he stated, rolling his eyes and beginning to inch towards the bleachers. Kat's eyes widened, as though Seymour had called her a slur. "You don't know about the urban legend?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Urban legend?" I muttered, barely loud enough for anyone to hear in the ever-growing noise of the gym. I had already heard about the basement rumor from Brandon earlier, but I, along with many others, had no clue about a whole urban legend surrounding the depths of the school. Kat turned to me as Seymour began to scan the bleachers for a place to get away from what in his mind was no doubt nonsense. Apparently back in '84, the basements weren't so locked up. A group of students went down there, and when they got back up, none of them were the same. The group's leader became paranoid and shut down. One of the group's members moved away, and the others all had terrible damage done to their psyches. One of them, Sean, ended up screaming in hysteria in the middle of lunch, and apparently the paramedics had to take him away, she said, almost in one breath. Don't get me wrong, I love Kat and all, but she's a bit over the top, especially when she's excited about something, which I could tell she was. "And what happened after?" I asked, beginning to move over to the bleachers to find some place to sit, and her following. Nobody knows. There are some variations of the story, some being with the students never coming back up, others with rumors of the gates of hell itself being below the tiles we're on right now. But either way, it ended up with entrances to the basement being bolted shut and never being opened again, she blurted. As we took our first steps onto the bleachers, I looked back at the bolted up door. It was a heavy metal, dented and scraped, but still too firm to be broken through easily. Two windows made of bulletproof glass sat dirtied as though it hadn't been cleaned by anyone ever. One on each door. Beyond that glass sat what seemed to be nothingness, a black void, creeping up from below the school, swallowing any light it had come in contact with, confined by only those two doors. I shuddered a bit at the sight, and my mind began to wander. What was down there that led to it being bolted shut? I began to question my earlier theory of it being more storage space, as if all the doors to the basement looked like those did. Then that'd mean nobody's been down there in a good bit. The rest of the day honestly became a bit of a blur until English class, as I made my way to my classes, weaving through halls, hoping I wouldn't get lost, until eventually I found myself in the upstairs room 204 with Seymour. I sat down in a seat that was assigned, that just so happened to be next to his. We talked idly for a bit, before the question of the basement came up. I asked him what he thought about the basement story, to which he just shrugged. "It's a whole load of crap if you ask me," he muttered, before burying his nose into a book, trying to avoid further conversation until the final bell rang. That next day began the same as the first, and all was normal until about lunchtime. I walked into the crowded cafeteria before deciding that it was too packed for me to remain in there. I left the small room and went into the hall, where students lined up to enter the cafeteria. I traced my hand down the wall until a familiar voice called my name. I looked over to see Kat sitting by the entrance to the main gym with both Seymour and Brandon, talking and laughing about 2 feet from her. I jogged over to her before she grabbed me by the arm, and Seymour and Brandon as well, telling them to follow. She pulled us down the hallway leading away from the gym into a small, largely avoided area of the school, with a wooden door with a window sitting at the end. She let go and plopped down in front of the door. As I sat down slowly, and Seymour and Brandon did the same. We sat in silence for about 30 seconds before Kat giggled. "So remember the basement?" she asked. Much to Seymour's dismay, Brandon and I nodded as she rose up from the floor and jiggled the wooden door behind her. With a creak, it opened into a black void, with the stairs leading down into what seemed to be nothing. I looked over a school map, and I noticed this area existed, leading down into the basement. "Do you all want to have a look tomorrow?" Brandon paused before saying slowly, "I'm not sure if this would be a good idea," he said, as Kat turned to close the door, making sure to not lock it. "Oh, come on, silly. Those legends are probably not true, and besides, we'll never know if we don't look, and nobody's been down there in years." Seymour cut Kat off. "That's exactly why we should avoid it. Nobody's been down there. It's probably not anything major, just black mold and asbestos," he stated. Kat turned to me, hopefully. I sighed and nodded, agreeing with her. "I wouldn't be opposed to finding out what was down there," I stated, as curiosity once again filled my mind. Kat flapped her hands giddily as she perked up some. "All right, Seymour and Brandon, if you decide to join us, meet us here the moment you get into the building. Bring a flashlight," she said, before jogging off and down the hall, disappearing into the crowd of students. I turned to Seymour, who was glaring at me. "What were you thinking?" he asked sternly. I stammered for a moment before answering. "Seymour, I know you're just as curious as me to find out what was down there. Plus, Kat managed to find the entrance within 2 days of being here at most. If we didn't go down there after that, she'd never shut up about it," I stated, before Brandon spoke up. "I don't know, Mike," he said to me. "I have a really bad feeling about this, honestly." He sighed, as Seymour began to stare at the wall. "You said that about our trip to the aquarium. You loved it. And you even bought a season pass into the aquarium later on," I stated. He sighed, before turning to Seymour. "What do you think?" he asked, making Seymour state his true thoughts about the basement. "I think it's dangerous. There could be black mold, leaks, God knows what down there. It was bolted up for a reason," he stated, before I blurted out something that I hadn't even thought about before saying. "Then come with us," I stated, unsure of my reasoning. He stared blankly for a moment before speaking up. "Fine, be here at 7:35 at the latest, and unless Brandon is also going, I'm staying up here," he said. After marching back to the main hallway, I turned to Brandon, who I could tell didn't want to go down there. "Fine, I'll go too," he stated. The whole rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about the basement. The second I got home, I threw my best flashlight into my school bag and immediately did a Google search of my high school. However, no matter how much I dug, nothing about the basement ever showed up. I ended up searching so long into the night that I fell asleep at the computer. Upon waking up, I immediately saw it was 6:45 a.m. I panicked, jolting upright and grabbing my almost dead phone, before throwing the nearest pair of shoes on and grabbing my bag. I booked it out the front door just as the bus began to pull up. I narrowly caught it and the bus came to a halt, allowing me to board. I immediately took to Brandon, who looked incredibly anxious about the upcoming event. "When I told you about the basement, I didn't mean it seriously. I don't want to go down there," he said. Before I even sat down, I smiled and asked him one question. "Did you bring your light?" He nodded. turned down to his backpack and pulling out a large diesel flashlight that looked older than him. I chuckled some before I asked him lightheartedly, "You sure that thing works?" I asked, as he put it back in his bag. "I hope it doesn't. I planned to grab this one so that I wouldn't have to go down if it didn't work," he said, turning to the window and gazing out. The rest of the ride had no words between us until we got to the school. I got out of the bus before him, and he told me a simple phrase, "Let's go." I followed him, despite his total shift in demeanor, as he led me once more through the halls into the back area where we met the previous day. Once we got there, we were surprised to find Seymour, but not Kat. Seymour looked up with a fearful expression as we approached him. Without sparing any time, he spat out a sentence. "Kat went down there." Brandon's eyes widened as he forgot all about his apparent fear of what was down there. "We need to get her," he said, with a low whisper. Seymour looked at Brandon with a face of disbelief. "I'm not heading down there," he said, before Brandon pulled his light out. "Look, I'll explain on the way. We need to get her out of there now," he said, sparing no time as he went for the wooden door. Seymour's eyes followed him before inching forward himself. I stepped forward just as Brandon opened the door up, revealing the darkness once more. "You made a deal," I said to Seymour, urging him to follow. He sighed but nodded, pulling his phone out for a light. One by one, we shuffled into the darkness until all three of us were on the landing before the flight of the stairs leading into the basement. I turned my light on and shone it around as Brandon closed the door most of the way. "We need to hurry," he said, as he urged Seymour and I down the flight of concrete steps. Whereas the main stairway ran down, this one put it to shame. Stains from God knows what decorated the surface of the stone stairs, and various scratch marks accompanied them. Cracks in the stairs also became evident before I had reached the halfway turn, and I shone my light up and in front of me, cutting through the darkness. What sat in front and below me was horrifying. A dark, wet hallway that seemed to mirror the one we had just came from, leading into what seemed to be nothingness. As the temperature dropped as I descended, Seymour and Brandon trailed behind me as they turned their lights on. Brandon told us both something that will stick with me forever as we reached the bottom of the stairs. "I don't care what you see or hear, we need to stick together, and the second we find Kat, we need to book it back upstairs," he said. As I wondered what he knew about this basement, I shone my light down the hallway to my left. As the darkness in front of me took back over, Brandon glanced around before urging us down the hallway. We walked into the pitch darkness, now in a temperature almost as cold as the winter's night, whispering among ourselves. Our feet clattering on the floor was the only other sound to be heard, and the smell became mustier and mustier the further we walked. It was clear we were one of the first to set foot here in forever. I shone my light above me as Brandon and Seymour's illuminated the path I was pointing mine down. The pipes and wires sat exposed above us, and every light bulb we crossed was shattered. It became clear that the basement was abandoned before it was ever finished, as we traveled further into the darkness for what felt like an eternity. Before Seymour paused, his phone was ringing. I stopped my walk and went over to him, as he accepted a call from our missing friend. It was Kat. He put the phone on the speaker just as she asked a question. "Where are you all?" she said, with the murmur of voices behind her, signifying something impossible. She was above us and in the halls of the school, still swimming with students. Our eyes went wide with collective fear and terror. We came down following you," Brandon stammered, as Seymour's face ran pale. My hands grew cold and I felt sick at her response. "I haven't even gone into the basement yet," she said. As my eyes focused on Seymour, he stammered his response out. "I saw you. Go down there." Before silence, my blood ran cold as Kat stated her next sentence. "I'm right outside the entrance we agreed on." I stared at Seymour, shaking. "Then how did Seymour see you?" I asked, before the most terrifying moment of my life occurred. Seymour's face contorted in fear of something behind me, as Brandon turned to face the same thing he was. All blood drained from his face. I spun on my heels, shining my light in the direction as Seymour muttered one line. "What the hell?" I backed up out of instinct, as my light fully illuminated what the others were staring at. Its body had spindly legs, too thin to be a human's. The torso appeared to just be a thin stick, barely holding the body together. Its arms dangled to the floor, tapping my foot lightly before pulling away. And its face was demented. Its skin was seemingly pulled back from its pale face, and several sunken eyes stared at me. Below it was what I presumed to be a mouth, but all I saw was a black, gaping hole. It stepped forward, impossibly quiet, as I stood there in pure shock and horror. Before I felt a pull from behind, I turned around, dropping my light, leaving it to idly beam on that thing. I was being pulled by someone, quickly away from whatever that thing was. I was pulled through the destroyed hallways as someone dragged me behind them. Before I found my feet on my own, I ran quicker than I've ever ran before, following the patter of the person ahead of me's footsteps. We tore down the hall, and I was certain that thing would grab me up and pull me back into that damp darkness. The feeling I felt when I saw the light shining in from the landing is indescribable. As the silhouette of Brandon and Seymour became more and more clear as we got closer, we ran up the first set of stairs before I turned to look back into the dark. That face peered back at me from the darkness. It followed us without making a sound as it crept towards the stairs. I jumped up the stairs as Seymour and Brandon dashed through, back into the light. I ran through the threshold, tripping onto my face as I made it through. As the door slammed shut behind me, I looked up only to see Kat staring at me in abject confusion. Brandon stepped forward and Seymour did as well. I shuffled to my feet and told Kat everything. I could tell she didn't believe a word of it, as she bounded to the door, only to be stopped by Seymour. He grabbed her hand, pulling her away from the door and down the hall. The moment I stood up, I instantly felt sick. I ended up puking my guts onto the floor, as Brandon ran off to God knows where. I went homesick that day, and haven't been back since. I haven't heard from Seymour until today, and Brandon only once. A simple text, stating one thing: we are not doing that again. Kat, on the other hand, has been calling me non-stop, demanding to know what was going on, accusing me of making this up, etc. My parents are growing suspicious of my new behavior, but still think I'm too sick to go back to school, and honestly, I hope it stays that way. Seymour messaged me recently, telling me that he was moving, and honestly, I can't blame him. I responded back, wishing him the best of luck, and that was that. It's been only 3 days since we went into the basement, and honestly, if you ever come across an area that you should avoid, and you should avoid it, those areas are closed off for a reason. It's official. I'm an old man. For the last couple of years, I've comforted myself by saying I'm in my early 70s. But math is simple and unforgiving. Today's my 75th birthday, and God, the years do fly. I'm not here for your well wishes. This is hardly a milestone I'm excited about. I'm glad to still be here, of course. But I find I have less and less to live for with every passing year. My bones ache, my kids live far away, and the other side of my bed has been empty for over 8 months now. In fact, once I cast my vote in this upcoming election, I may have nothing left to live for at all. So spare me your happy birthdays and your congratulations, if you please. I'm here because I have a story for you, and it's one I've never told before. I used to think I kept it inside because it was silly, or because nobody would believe it. I've found, though, that the older you grow, the more exhausting it becomes to lie to yourself. If I'm being perfectly honest, I've never told anybody this story because it scares me, almost to death, but death seems friendlier than it used to. So listen close. The year was 1950. The setting, a small town in Maine. I was a boy of 9, rather small for my age, with only one friend in the world to speak of. And his family, seemingly on a whim, decided to move 2,000 miles away. It was shaping up to be the worst summer of my life. My pop wasn't around, and my mom was a chore whore. Boy, was I proud of myself when I came up with that one. So I wasn't apt to hang out around the house. With some hesitation, I decided the public library was the place to be that summer. The library's collection of books, particularly children's books, was meager to say the least. But within the walls of that miserly structure, I would find no undone chores, no nagging mother, God rest her soul, and perhaps most importantly, no other children with whom I would be expected to associate. I was the only kid with a low enough social status to spend his precious time of freedom sulking amid the bookshelves, and that was just fine with me. The first half of my summer was even more dreadful than I had imagined it would be. I would sleep in until 10, do my chores, and then ride my bike to the library. And by bike, I mean rusty heap of garbage attached to a pair of wheels. Once there, I would split my time between unintentionally annoying the elderly patrons and deliberately doing so. One pleasant lady actually interrupted my incessant tongue clicking to hiss a "shut the hell up" at me. The first time I ever heard a grown-up use a swear word. Big deal, I know. But in those days, it was unheard of. The dreary days turned into woeful weeks. I had actually begun praying for school to start again until I discovered the basement. I could have sworn I roamed every inch of that library, but one day, in the far corner behind the foreign language collection, I stumbled across a small wooden door I'd never seen before. That was where it all began. The door was windowless and made from oak that looked far older than the wall on which it rested. It had a knob of black metal that quite literally looked ancient. I wouldn't have been surprised to learn it was crafted in the 17th century. Engraved on the doorknob was what appeared to be a single footprint. I had the sense that whatever lay beyond this door was forbidden to me, and therefore probably the most interesting thing I would encounter all summer. I quickly glanced around to make sure nobody was watching me, then turned the heavy knob, slipped behind the door, and shut it. There was nothing, only darkness. I took a couple of steps and then stopped, unnerved by the totality of the shadow which surrounded me. I waved my hands in front of me in an attempt to find a wall, or a shelf, or anything to hold on to. What I actually found was far more subtle. A small string dangling from above, but far more useful. I grabbed it firmly and pulled it down. Back in the day, lots of light bulbs were operated by strings, and this was one of them. My surroundings were instantly illuminated. I was standing on a small, dusty platform that looked as though it hadn't seen life in quite some time. To my left was a crickety spiral staircase, made of wood and appearing ready to collapse at any second. The bulb was the only source of light in the room, and it was feeble. So when I peered over the railing to see what lay below, the bottom of the staircase dissolved into the darkness. I was beginning to feel scared. This place, wherever I was, seemed to have no business being in a town library. It was as though I were in a completely different building, but no 9-year-old likes to let a mystery go unsolved. Looking back, I wish I could have told my prepubescent self to turn around, go back, do anything else besides descending that staircase. You'll be spared a lot of sleepless nights, I'd say. But of course, I didn't know that then, and I may not have listened even if I had. So instead of turning back, I took a deep breath, gripped the railing, and glared resolutely forward as I began my descent. The wood on the railing was dry and covered with splinters. I immediately let go, holding my hands out for balance as I carefully traversed the staircase. It was, or at least seemed, very long, and with only the dim glow from the string bulb far above me. My heart pounded mercilessly in the darkness. Even kids can sense when something isn't right, I think. They just don't always care. By the time my feet reached the cement floor at the bottom, the light from the bulb above was very nearly a memory. But there was a new light source in God. I'll never forget it. Directly in front of me was a door, massive, and a deep shade of red. The light was coming from behind the door, and it shone out in thin lines from all 4 sides. A sinister, dimly glowing rectangle. For the second time, I took a deep breath and went through a door I shouldn't have, in contrast from the dark room I entered from. The room behind the door was blinding. When my eyes adjusted, what I saw nearly took my breath away. It was a library. The most perfect library imaginable. I gaped in wonder as I stepped in, almost reverently further into the room. It was beautiful. It was smaller than the library above, much smaller, but it seemed to be almost tailor-made for me. The shelves were packed with brightly colored titles. Both armchairs in the middle of the room were exquisitely comfortable. And the smell? My God, the smell was simply unbelievable. Sort of a mixture of citrus and pine. I simply can't do it justice with words, so I'll suffice it to say that I've never smelled anything better. Not in my 75 years. What was this room? Why had I never heard of it before? Why was nobody else here? Those were the questions I should have been asking, but I was intoxicated as I gazed across at all the books and basked in the smell of paradise. I could only form one thought: I will never be bored again. In truth, boredom only hid from me for 3 years. It was on my 12th birthday, 63 years ago, to this day, that everything changed. Before that day, I visited my basement sanctuary as often as I could, usually several times a week. I never saw another soul down there, yet strangely remained free of suspicion. I never removed a book from that room, but instead would pick up a particular volume whenever I had stopped reading during my previous visit. I sat always in the same deep purple armchair, and always leaving its twin barren, and directly across from myself. That armchair was mine. The other's was, well, I suppose I couldn't have articulated it then much better than I can now. But it wasn't mine. That's for damn sure. On my 12th birthday, I arrived later than usual. My mom had invited a couple of classmates and some cousins over to our house to celebrate, a gesture that I found more tedious than touching, really. I just wanted to spend my birthday sitting and reading and smelling paradise. Eventually, our guests went home, and I made it to the library about 15 minutes before closing time. That didn't matter. The workers never checked down there before they locked up. I was free to stay as late as I wished. This particular night, I was devouring the final chapter of an epic adventure. Knights, swords, dragons, and the like. I didn't smell it until I read the final words and closed the book. The once exquisite aroma of that room had turned sour. I sat for a moment, unsettled. Objectively, I could recognize that the smell was actually the same it had been before. That mixture of citrus and pine. I just perceived it differently, and I didn't like it anymore. It was the nasal version of an optical illusion, you know? The one that looks like a younger woman glancing backward, but all of a sudden, you see that it's really an old woman facing towards you. You can't unsee that, and I couldn't unsmell this. The spell was broken. The odor also seemed for the first time to be coming from somewhere specific. With a fair amount of trepidation, I stalked around the room, sniffing the air like a crazed canine, until I came to a shelf near the back. The shelf was perfectly normal, with the exception of one title, a large, leather-bound cover of solid faded maroon, with one striking black footprint at the top of the spine. This was the source of the smell. I opened the front cover and saw one sentence scrawled neatly in red blood ink at the top of the first page. Rest your sorrows down, friend, and leave them where they lie. I stared at this sentence, mesmerized. As I began to retreat to my chair, I turned a page, blank. The smell became stronger, another page, blank. And the smell grew stronger still. I stopped for a moment and suppressed a gag, and continued walking. Then, as I neared the armchairs, I turned one final page, and there, in the same sinister print, was the last thing I expected to see. My own name. I dropped the book and began to sprint towards the door, but as I shifted my gaze forward, my heart leapt to my throat, and I stopped in my tracks. The empty chair wasn't empty anymore. An aged man in a suit sat before me. One leg crossed over the other, contemplating me with piercing gray eyes and a light smirk. This was all too much. I fell to my knees and expelled the contents of my stomach onto the carpet. I wiped my mouth, staring at my vomit, when I heard the man let out a chuckle. I stared at him disbelievingly. "Who are you?" I asked, panic in my voice. The man leapt to his feet, grabbed me gently by the shoulders, and held me to my chair. He sat once again in his own. "I fear we've got off on a bad start," he said, glancing at the pile of sick on the carpet. "The smell, it does take some getting used to." "Who are you?" I repeated. "Tonight, you will know hardship like you've never known," he said. "I come as a friend, offering you refuge from it, and from all other storms which lie ahead." I wanted nothing more than to leave at that moment, but I remained seated. I asked him what he was talking about. "Your mother is dead, my boy, by her own hand in her kitchen. The scene is gruesome, I must admit," he said in sorrowful tones. But was there a playful glint in his eye? "Surely you wish to avoid this path. I can show you a safer one." My blood ran cold at the horrors this man spoke of, but I did not believe him. "What do you want with me?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. He laughed, an old raspy yelp that seemed to shake him to his bones. "Nothing but your friendship, dear boy," he said. Then, sensing that I found his answer inadequate, he expounded. I want you to come on a journey with me. My work is noble, and you will make a fine apprentice. And maybe, when I'm done, he sighed tiredly, running his bony fingers through his thin white hair. Maybe then, my work can be yours. I stood up, shuffling towards the door, but never breaking his gaze. You're crazy, I told him. My mom isn't dead. She's not. See for yourself, if you must, he said, gesturing towards the door. I threw him a contemptuous glare and bolted for the exit. As my hand closed around the knob, he said my name softly. In spite of myself, I turned around. Your road won't be easy, friend. If it ever becomes too much for you, and I mean ever, he said, pausing to sweep his hand over the room. You know where to find me. I slammed the door behind me and took the decrepit stairs 2 at a time. I exited the library, clambered onto my bike, and hightailed it home. The front door was wide open. I dismounted, leaving my bike in a heap on the ground, and approached the house cautiously. The old man was lying. He must have been. Still, tears began to sting my eyes, heart pounding. I stepped inside and called for my mother. I heard no answer, so I turned into the kitchen. To this day, I don't know why she did it. I've lived in that small town of Maine my entire life, although I've kept mostly clear of the public library. Once, in my late 20s, I summoned the courage to step inside. Life was good at that time, and my fear had begun to morph into idle curiosity. Where the door to my basement sanctuary once stood was only a blank wall. I asked the librarian what had become of that basement, though in my heart, I knew the answer. There was no basement, she said. There had never been a basement. In fact, if she had her facts correctly, city zoning ordinances prohibited a basement in the area. I've been haunted by that sickly sweet smell, that poisonous blend of citrus and pine, ever since that long ago birthday, when I saw my mom in the kitchen that day, collapsed in a pool of her own blood. I smelt it when a man claiming to be my father knocked on my college apartment door, begged me for money, and beat me to within an inch of my life when I refused. I smelt it when my wife miscarried our second child. I smelt it. And again when she miscarried our fourth. When our oldest son got behind the wheel of our family Buick drunk and got his girlfriend killed. I smelt it. I began to smell it periodically as my wife became sick. She died late last year, and now I'm alone for the first time in more than half a century. Now, I smell it every day, and it feels like an invitation. A few months ago, I went back to the library, and the small oak door with the ancient handle was there, right where it used to be. My evening walk has brought me past that library every day since, but I haven't gone inside. Maybe tonight I will. I'm frightened to die, yes, but lately, I'm even more frightened to keep living. The old man was right. My road hasn't been easy, and I doubt it will get any easier. Rest your sorrows down, friend, and leave them where they lie. He promised relief, a refuge, he said. Was he right about that too? There's only one way to find out. After all, I still know where to find him.